The pastor said, "You're in Texas, now it's a local call."
The aftershocks of Traoré's decisive stance continued to reverberate across the continent and beyond. Weeks turned into months, yet the momentum he had unleashed showed no sign of fading. What many outside observers initially dismissed as a passing surge of popular sentiment was gradually revealing itself to be a deeper, more structural awakening. The question was no longer whether Traoré's move had stunned the West. It clearly had, but whether this shock would translate into a durable realignment of power or dissolve into familiar patterns of backlash and compromise that history so often delivered. In the bustling markets of his capital city, traders spoke of the sudden changes with a mix of cautious hope and everyday pragmatism. Prices of certain imported goods had risen due to disrupted supply chains, yet local industries, long dormant under the weight of unfair competition, were beginning to stir. Small workshops expanded production. Farmers received incentives to boost output, and entrepreneurs who had once abandoned their ambitions in the face of monopolistic foreign contracts found themselves courted by new domestic programs. There were challenges, of course, logistical bottlenecks, shortages of skilled labor, the lingering threat of capital flight. But for the first time in a generation, the conversation had shifted from mere survival to building something enduring. Traoré's government launched initiatives that were as symbolic as they were practical. National service programs brought young graduates into rural areas to work on infrastructure and agricultural projects, both to provide employment and to bridge the growing divide between urban elites and the countryside. New curricula were rolled out in schools, emphasizing local history, critical thinking, and practical skills over rote learning of foreign systems. There was an insistence on reclaiming narratives. Museums were funded, archives were opened, and forgotten heroes of anti-colonial resistance were celebrated in public spaces once named after foreign dignitaries. These measures were not universally popular. Certain segments of society, particularly those with close ties to Western economies, worried about the risks of alienation and economic retaliation. Foreign investors quietly withdrew or paused projects, citing instability. And in some urban neighborhoods, whispers of discontent grew louder, yet the overall mood remained resilient. For many, the trade-off between temporary discomfort and the promise of genuine sovereignty was one worth making. They had seen too many decades of polished promises that delivered little beyond dependency, and they were willing to test a new path. In Western capitals, debates grew more heated. Policymakers were divided between those advocating for a hardline approach, tightening sanctions, restricting access to international financial systems, and funding opposition movements, and those arguing for a pragmatic reset that acknowledged the changing winds. Leaked memos spoke of frantic meetings, late-night calls with regional allies, and contingency plans that ranged from diplomatic isolation to covert interference. The sense of entitlement that had long characterized Western dealings in the region was now tempered by a reluctant recognition. The world was no longer theirs alone to shape. At international summits, Traoré cut a striking figure. He was not the first African leader to speak of equality and respect, but he did so at a time when alternative poles of power were eager to listen. In Beijing and Moscow and Ankara, doors opened that had long been closed. Yet he was careful to avoid the trap of overdependence on any single partner. His strategy, advisors whispered, was one of controlled pluralism, to engage with all, to align with none uncritically. Trade agreements were signed, but always with clauses emphasizing technology transfer, local employment, and environmental accountability. Defense pacts were considered, but never at the cost of permanent foreign bases. It was a balancing act that required both finesse and constant vigilance. Among the youth, particularly in universities and urban hubs, Traoré's name became shorthand for a new era. Student groups organized forums to debate his policies. Artists composed songs and murals that reflected the newfound sense of pride and a generation that had grown accustomed to migration as their only hope began to reimagine futures at home. Social media campaigns turned his image into an icon, sometimes idealized, sometimes satirized, but always present. Even those critical of certain policies acknowledged the unprecedented space for dialogue his reforms had created. Meanwhile, in the rural heartlands where the majority of his people lived, the changes took on a different texture. Roads were being repaired, cooperatives formed to pool resources, and long-neglected irrigation projects revived. Elders who had seen governments come and go spoke of a cautious optimism, tempered by memory but fueled by the tangible signs of inclusion. For decades, they had watched wealth extracted from their soil with little return. Now they were being asked, not just rhetorically but practically, to become stakeholders in its future. The West's sense of being stunned evolved over time into a mixture of frustration, recalibration, and reluctant respect. Media outlets that had initially portrayed Traoré as a reckless populist began to nuance their coverage, noting the breadth of his domestic support and the sophistication of his policies. Think tanks published reports warning that continued hostility might only deepen Africa's drift toward non-Western alliances. Some nations, particularly those with more flexible foreign policies, quietly resumed dialogue, seeking to secure at least a foothold in the new order. Yet, the old tools of pressure were not entirely abandoned. Loans were called in, credit ratings adjusted, and targeted propaganda campaigns launched. Traoré's government, anticipating these moves, accelerated its push for financial independence, creating regional payment systems, encouraging diaspora investment, and pursuing debt restructuring with partners more amenable to his vision. The path was neither smooth nor linear. There were moments of crisis, currency fluctuations, rumors of coup plots, and heated parliamentary debates. But each test, once weathered, seemed only to deepen the public's sense that something irreversible had begun. Outside his borders, the ripple effects grew. Leaders in neighboring countries watched closely, some with admiration, others with apprehension. Opposition parties in various African states invoked his example, arguing that it was possible to challenge entrenched foreign interests without descending into chaos. Pan-African organizations, long criticized as toothless, began to gain renewed relevance as populations pushed for regional cooperation that reflected their aspirations rather than external dictates. Even in distant diasporas, the story of Traoré was retold with pride, a reminder that the continent was not destined to remain a pawn. There were darker currents as well. Armed groups, smugglers, and political spoilers sought to exploit the turbulence for their gain. Foreign intelligence services probed for weaknesses. Old elites, displaced from their comfortable arrangements, plotted returns. Traoré responded with a mixture of firmness and outreach, integrating some, marginalizing others, and building security networks that were as much about local legitimacy as about raw force. He knew that without stability, the fight for Africa that Ibrahim Traoré came to symbolize did not end with his initial proclamations or early reforms. It evolved into a longer, more complex contest of willpower, diplomacy, and resilience. If the first stage of his leadership was about announcing a rupture with the old order and laying the ideological foundation for sovereignty, the subsequent phase tested whether that vision could withstand the entrenched realities of geopolitics, entrenched elites, and the structural weaknesses that decades of dependency had left behind. It was one thing to declare independence of spirit. It was another to build a scaffolding of material autonomy in a world whose financial, trade, and security systems often punish deviation from established norms. As his administration pushed deeper into the restructuring of Burkina Faso's political economy, the backlash became more pronounced. International lenders imposed tougher conditions. Foreign investors hedged their bets, and Western governments, some openly, others covertly, sought to limit his outreach to alternative partners. Sanctions, trade slowdowns, and subtle diplomatic isolation became part of the pressure matrix. Yet, Traoré framed this not as a deterrent, but as proof that Africa's assertion of its rights unsettled the status quo. His speeches took on a tone both defiant and rallying. He urged other African states not to be cowed by threats, to form collective fronts that could resist coercion more effectively than any single nation could. This was the period in which his vision of regional solidarity took firmer shape. He pushed for Sahelian cooperation, not merely in security matters, but also in trade, infrastructure, and resource management. Memoranda were signed with neighboring states to coordinate border patrols, pool intelligence, and share resources for joint agricultural and energy projects. The rhetoric of Pan-Africanism that once lived largely in books and activist slogans began to find cautious expression in policy. The underlying message was clear. Only by standing together could African nations escape the chronic vulnerability that left them susceptible to foreign dictates. In the second act, Traoré also sought to confront the domestic challenges that threatened to hollow out his reforms. Corruption, long entrenched, did not vanish with a change of guard. He initiated sweeping audits of government contracts, arrested high-profile figures accused of embezzlement, and set up new anti-graft agencies with mixed civilian and military oversight. These moves earned him both applause and enmity. Many ordinary citizens welcomed the sight of previously untouchable elites being held to account, but critics decried selective justice and warned that such campaigns, if overly politicized, could morph into tools of repression. The media landscape likewise reflected this tension. Independent journalists found space, at times, to celebrate the resurgence of national pride. Yet many also bristled at the government's tendency to clamp down on dissent under the guise of national security. Traoré's defenders argued that extraordinary times required extraordinary measures. His detractors saw the creeping shadow of authoritarian consolidation. The balance between security imperatives and civic freedoms, never easy in fragile states, became one of the defining paradoxes of his rule. Economically, his policies began to yield modest but symbolic results. Revised mining contracts delivered higher royalties to the Treasury, some of which were channeled into rural electrification, school construction, and basic health care. Pilot projects in agro-processing aimed to reduce the country's dependence on raw commodity exports. Renewable energy projects, especially solar installations in sun-rich regions, received renewed emphasis, both to alleviate chronic power shortages and to signal commitment to sustainable development. Traoré understood that sovereignty was hollow if it did not translate into tangible improvements in daily life. Water pumps, functioning clinics, secure roads. Still, the macroeconomic indicators painted a mixed picture. Inflation rose due to external shocks and the recalibration of subsidies. Unemployment, especially among urban youth, remained stubbornly high, testing the patience of the same demographic that had initially rallied behind his message. Migration outflows, both internal and towards North Africa and Europe, continued, reflecting persistent gaps between aspiration and opportunity. In this sense, the fight for Africa was not a triumphant march, but a grinding struggle, in which every step forward was met with friction, delay, and compromise. Internationally, Traoré's profile grew. He addressed gatherings not only in African capitals, but also at forums in Asia, Latin America, and select European venues where sympathetic intellectuals and solidarity movements welcomed his frankness. He spoke of a multipolar world where Africa would not be a pawn, but a pole in its own right. He insisted that climate negotiations must account for Africa's historical marginalization, its low contribution to global emissions, its high vulnerability, and its right to develop using its resources without moralizing lectures from the very powers that had industrialized at Africa's expense. This positioning drew parallels to earlier generations of leaders: Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Patrice Lumumba, and of course Thomas Sankara, whose bold visions often clashed with global systems. Yet, Traoré's era was different. He operated in a digital age, where narratives spread instantly, where diasporas amplified messages across oceans, and where alliances could be forged not only through formal treaties, but through network movements, trade in cryptocurrency, and partnerships with non-traditional actors. This gave his message a broader reach, but also a more volatile field of contestation. As months turned to years, the measure of his fight was less about fiery speeches and more about resilience under pressure. He survived at least one reported assassination attempt and numerous plots, some allegedly backed by external powers unsettled by his defiance. Each close call reinforced a perception that his struggle was not merely personal but emblematic, and Africa trying to chart its own course would not be allowed to do so quietly. It would face sabotage, disinformation, even covert destabilization. Yet, there was also a subtle evolution in his approach. Where once he had spoken in absolutes, no more